All right.
All right. Okay. So I think listeners of Geopolitics and Empire would recognize John Rubino. You've been with us a number of times. You're founder of dollarcollapse.com. You're author and co-author of a number of great books, which people should check out. And so we were just talking about the 2008 global financial crisis, and I thought, you wrote a really interesting piece recently called that this is the least important election of our lifetimes. And I think it's tied to your thesis, the thesis you've had for the past couple years, where you look at the big picture, which is that the US and many or most countries around the world are insolvent and that we're heading for a crash. And so, maybe you could tell us why this is the least important election, which I think has to do with the dollar collapse.
Yeah, well, the U.S. election is in large part about personalities. Trump just rubs 48% of the population the wrong way. And the people who are, triggered by Trump and acting out are rubbing a big part of the population otherwise the wrong way also. So you've got people hating each other in the U.S. now. We've become very tribal. And it's easy when you're living in this little tribe and only hearing the opinions of other people who agree with you to dehumanize people who disagree with you. And that's where we are right now. We've got people watching Fox News and people watching MSNBC and getting completely different worldviews from it. And because of that, this election feels existential. We've got people, gun sales are through the roof in the U.S. right now. And we've got civil unrest and lots of things going on besides the coronavirus lockdown. So, as if we didn't already have enough to worry about, we've got political turmoil. So to a lot of people, this election feels like the most important election of our lifetimes and everything. And, in terms of policy, it's really not. In terms of personalities, yeah, it's a very different country depending on who's in charge, but only in terms of tone, not in terms of policy. If the Republicans get a conservative Supreme Court, that's marginally important for a couple of social issues and maybe a couple of corporate versus non-corporate related cases that come to the Supreme Court, but it's not that big of a deal. And it also won't be that big of a deal in terms of immigration or drug policy or foreign policy, most of, and certainly not in financial policy. Most of what we've been doing under Trump is similar to what we were doing under President Obama. And it will be similar to what happens under President Biden if he comes into office. We're still going to run $1 trillion plus deficits. We're still going to bail out everybody in sight next year. We really don't have a choice because of the pandemic to either bail people out or not bail people out. If we don't bail out the airlines and the cruise lines and the hotel chains and the restaurants and the state and local governments, those entities will go bankrupt one way or another. States can't legally go bankrupt, but they will default on a lot of their obligations. And that will send the economy into a Great Depression 2.0. And nobody who's in charge wants to have that happen on their watch. So we will see massive bailouts and massive money printing and huge deficits, no matter who's in charge. So I really don't think it matters all that much other than, entertainment value, who's in charge next year. Trump is more fun than Biden because he's basically a stand-up comedian who somehow got elected president, and he's got this big audience and he's having fun with it. But there isn't a lot of substantive stuff that he's accomplished. Cutting corporate taxes is the easiest thing in the world. Cutting taxes is simple. It's like raising spending for the Democrats. It's something that everybody wants you to do, so you can go ahead and do it with no real political downside. And that's largely all that Trump got done in his first 4 years. So maybe, his next 4 years will be somewhat more productive in the direction of, the wall or immigration reform in general, or I'm hesitant to think we will be free of any kind of foreign entanglements under Trump. He'll try to pull us out of some wars, but I don't think he'll succeed. So And meanwhile, we'll be going broke at an accelerating rate either way. So yeah, I don't think this is that important, an election, but in terms of policy going forward. But one thing it could be important for is the civil unrest that comes if this thing is a contested election. If tonight doesn't settle it, and we've got all these mail-in ballots and other kinds of things, voting machines that are hacked and polling places that are closed and have to have different hours. If all this stuff's going on and the lawyers for both sides are just feasting out there on all of these questions, and somebody ends up getting declared the winner, the guys who lose are going to think they got cheated. And since we're already, in the middle of an episode of civil unrest here in the U.S., that could really exacerbate that side of the problem. We could see some very serious riots as one side or the other decides they've been cheated and that they're not going to put up with it, and they hit the streets. And that scares me. And I guess you could call that a consequence of this election, but I think it's more a consequence of just our past mismanagement. We have angered the average American to such an extent that they're ready to go. They're gearing up for civil war here. You can't even buy a gun because they've all been bought out there. We are just the most heavily armed democracy that's ever been.
I have a question
and a
on
lot
the
of people are split. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. On the point of view mentioning state and municipal defaults, there's a double question here. Has a United States state defaulted before, as in not being bailed out, but actually going through default? Is there precedent? And the other question is, if a country defaults, well, countries can't default. I mean, you can't sell the country to whoever gets money. But if a country defaults, we have a mechanism called the Club of Paris, a mechanism since 1956. So would that Club of Paris mechanism apply to states defaulting, and is there precedent of a state defaulting?
Well, countries do default all the time, and they just work it out. It's something that happens via their currency markets, or a big, a group of banks get together and help the country get past their default. So that happens. States in the U.S. are trickier because technically they can't default legally. They don't have a legal mechanism like Chapter 11. With companies, they don't have that kind of thing. But if they can't pay their bills, they can't pay their bills. They're going to have to default on some of their obligations. And it's hard to imagine an international solution to this, because this is a U.S. problem. And the U.S. government has an unlimited printing press. They can bail out the states by just creating another $3 trillion and handing it to California and New York and Kentucky and Illinois and Connecticut and New Jersey, and wiping out the debts of those states. They could totally do it. So there's no reason for the international community to get involved. But the problem with that is that there's a limit to how much a country can borrow and still have a functioning currency. And the question for the U.S. is, where is that limit? Like, where's the brick wall that we hit in terms of taking on new debt and creating new currency that stops us cold and prevents us from being able to continue to live beyond our means? And nobody knows where that is, because we have the world's reserve currency, which means a lot of people around the world still think dollars are valuable and still will take dollars. If we print them or electronically create them, they'll give us real stuff for those dollars. But there's a limit to that. And bailing out the states and the cities and the airlines and all those other companies I just mentioned would probably tax our ability to continue to create new currency. And then once the value of a major currency starts to fall, then its country loses the main tool it has for manipulating markets. And so that's what I worry about for us, that we're heading into a time when the financial system just doesn't work anymore because it's too deeply indebted, it's too over-leveraged. And then we have nothing left. We've got immense debts that we can't pay. And we've got obligations around the world. We've got a military empire that costs us $1 trillion a year, and a cradle-to-grave entitlement system that costs about that too. So, take away our ability to borrow money to fund those things, there's no telling what happens. So that's what I see in our future. And the coronavirus lockdown just accelerated this process by causing us to borrow insane amounts of money this year and forcing us to borrow just that much more next year, and bringing the point at which we can't do that anymore closer. So, it may be a 2021 problem, or it may be a few years further down the road, but sooner or later, we're going to get there, and we're going to have an insoluble financial problem. And that's when things get really interesting, because what do you do if you have a problem you can't solve?
And speaking of civil unrest, I was listening to an interview you gave recently talking about your wife, who's not a prepper, but she's like, yeah, we got to get some guns.
She's a prepper now, yeah.
And the airlines as well. I'm here in Mexico, and I'm going to need to do some flying pretty soon. And I was reading today, one of the airlines canceled all their flights because they hadn't paid for the fuel. They didn't have money to pay for the fuel. So
yeah. Well, almost any kind of a transportation or hospitality industry is operating at really low occupancy rates now. And in the case of the airlines, there aren't enough seats being filled with paying customers to pay for the planes and for the pilots and for the flight attendants and food and all the other stuff that it costs, that you have to buy to run an airline. So yeah, they will run out of money if the lockdown doesn't end immediately, or they don't get some huge bailout from their government. And so that's what next year is going to be all about. We're going to be trying to figure out, well, okay, do we just adopt the Sweden model and get rid of the lockdown and go back to economic normality in order to save the economy? Or do we stay locked down to prevent the spread of this disease at the cost of some gigantic increase in debt and potentially a huge financial crisis out there? So yeah, what you saw with the airlines is going to be replicated around the world 1,000 times, with all these other hotel chains and restaurants and retail stores. It's all going to happen to those guys in the same way. And who knows how we fix it? I don't know that there is a fix for it.
And as you said, we've kind of reached the end of the road. Francis Fukuyama said in the 90s that was the end of history. And I think now we're approaching the real true end of history in a sense. And what do you see kind of beyond the pale? Because there are various solutions being proposed. All of the world's nations are proposing these digital currencies, and we can see that next year there were some plans that I saw that by November of 2021, a lot of countries are going to start going live with these digital systems and currencies. Christine Lagarde recently tweeted about going online with the digital euro. Then we have all this talk about IMF, digital special drawing rights, gold. What's your kind of favorite theory of what might most likely happen when the system crashes?
Well, the thing to understand with digital currencies is that they're still currencies if they're run by a nation and they're not based on anything. If they're just a fiat currency, but they operate on the blockchain instead of via Visa and MasterCard and Bank of America, no difference. The government can still create that currency in infinite quantities and spend it as it sees fit. And because of that, its value is inevitably going to plunge. What a blockchain-based digital currency is a better transaction mechanism. We think, we'll see if that turns out to be true, but it looks like just a faster way to move money around. But it doesn't solve the problem of fiat currency, which is that we've basically taken away the link between our money and something real that limits the increase in supply of our money. And it'll be the same way if we have a digital dollar and a digital euro and a digital yen. Governments will still be creating them like crazy. And so their value will still be trending down, just maybe in a more efficient way transactionally as well. So we still have to have some kind of a monetary reset out there where we admit that the experiment with fiat currencies didn't work. And we go to something else. There are people who say that Bitcoin is the solution because it is a currency with a limited supply. And we could go to Bitcoin as our reserve currency and base our other currencies on Bitcoin. But, something that lives online, in cyberspace is hackable somehow, some way. So that worries me about, even a cryptocurrency with an algorithmically limited supply can still be messed with by the NSA or the CIA or the Russian mafia or China's, the army branch in China that does hacking. So it's not that secure.
But that same argument would apply also to central bank digital currencies. I mean, that's
absolutely. Yeah. Central bank currencies are not secure either because your bank account can be hacked. Your brokerage account can be hacked. And the governments themselves can ruin those currencies by creating too many of them. So the currencies that we have now are fatally flawed. And the question is, what do we go to next? And it seems like the simplest solution is to go back to what worked for 200 years, which is a gold standard, where we link, or actually we just redefine our currencies as a given weight of gold.
I can imagine, as seen by central bankers and Christine Lagarde and those people, there is a flaw to the current fiat system. And that flaw, as seen from their perspective, so that's my disclaimer, that flaw might be that there's cash. There's tangible money. You can get it from the money machine. So the way I look at it, central bank digital currencies is like pretty much the same experience as my current bank account, only without the cash. Is that am I right there to assume
yes.
that cash will be gone? It's like killing the lifeboat.
Well, they would love to get rid of cash for a variety of reasons. One is it's, a legitimate reason is that it's a pain in the butt to run a cash-based system because you've got to keep printing this paper and it wears out and you've got to keep track of it. And it's a disease vector, we just found out lately here. But the other reason they want to get rid of it is because it's the last vestige of financial privacy. You guys and I can contract with cash and nobody has to know about it. But that's the only way that we can do it privately. If we use credit cards or bank checks or anything like that, there's a record of it, which the NSA in the US is vacuuming up every second of every hour of every day and keeping track of to use against you at some point if you cross the government in any other way, in any way. So we will do away with cash at some point because governments really want to do that. And it's just way more convenient to use electronic money. I mean, I don't use all that much cash, even though I like the idea that it exists. But someday it won't exist anymore. And that just that opens the door to even more sharply negative interest rates, for instance. Because one of the problems with negative interest rates is that people who have money in the bank will see their bank accounts get smaller year after year after year as those negative interest rates bite. So they will take their money out and just get cash and then hide that cash somewhere. And that interferes with the functioning of the financial system from the point of view of central banks. It means they can't manipulate markets as easily as they could if there was no cash. So yeah, they'll do their best to get rid of cash, but that won't save us. I mean, that just accelerates the process of all the big countries going broke at varying rates until we all go broke instantly.
I get listeners asking me questions like, "What can we do?" I've asked you multiple times, as well as many of my guests. When we talk about economics, what can the average Joe do? I'm reminded of Teddy Roosevelt's quote, do what you can with what you've got, where you are. So, what are just some, and people can go read your books. I mean, they're excellent. You co-authored one with James Turk of goldmoney.com. But what are some basics now in the situation where we're in at the end of 2020, some fundamental things that people can do to prepare for an uncertain future?
The first thing is to recognize that your vote doesn't matter in terms of the financial crisis that's coming. I mean, you can vote for lots of things and change the world at the margins right now, but you can't stop this gigantic financial crisis because, nobody that you can elect is going to do anything to stop it. Everybody's invested in the current system. So what you have to do is protect yourself and your family because that's all that's left. So, the concept of prepper has some negative connotations. But conceptually, I think it's what people should be looking at right now. We should be preparing for a time when there's a lot of financial turmoil and possibly civil unrest and possibly, weird government policies being implemented because they're panicking in the throes of a financial / political crisis. And try to structure your life so that you are immune to as much of that stuff as possible. And, here in the US right now, the hottest part of the real estate market is rural land. Everybody's trying to buy a homestead because they want to be able to grow their own food. So they don't have to depend on global food supply chains, which are all of a sudden not that stable, right? Not that reliable. And gun sales are through the roof, which implies that people are kind of getting ready for either a civil war or some kind of a real period of uncertainty in which they can't necessarily count on the police to save them from trouble. Those are buying an arsenal or buying a farm are fairly extreme responses to this. I like the idea of both of them personally, and I can totally see how someone would want to do that. But the financial fix is easier. Just go out and buy a bunch of gold and silver on the assumption that those are the kinds of old forms of money that we have used for 3,000 years, and they've always held their value. So they will more than likely hold their value again when we screw up our currencies yet another time. You can go all the way back to the Roman Empire and before, and there were hyperinflations, and there was civil unrest, there were revolutions, there were natural disasters. Gold and silver stayed valuable through all of it for 3,000 years. So it will again. And that's how you insulate your finances from the kind of hyperinflation-ish thing that might come if we continue to borrow all this money and create all this new currency, and it leads to an accelerating decline in the value of our monies. And that's relatively simple and uncontroversial. You just go buy a bunch of silver coins, put them in a very safe place, maybe shift out of your bank stocks and your Google and your Amazon stock and buy some gold mining stocks. And you're, to an extent, protected financially from what's coming, because those things that you're buying will tend to go up while your bank stocks and while your government bonds and things like that are falling in price along with the currency. So you can do that without having to make any kind of an ideological statement.
So
I get that gold bugs are also part of the, in a lot of people's minds, part of the prepper community, and are maybe seen as survivalists also and everything. But it's a relatively easy, simple thing to do that does help prepare you for what's coming.
Have you and your wife picked up farming? That will be my last question. Or maybe not just yet.
My wife is serious about this, so I'm kind of being pulled along into, from being a city boy gold bug into being a gentleman farmer. So we'll see in a few years. That might be my new persona.
Oh, all right. How about you?
All right. I think our next guest is here, Jim. No?
Oh, he dropped out. He was here in the waiting room, and now he's disconnected. Maybe
I'm not sure, John, if you're familiar with Jim Jatras, the former U.S. diplomat.
Can you text him that he should come back in the room?
No, but that sounds interesting.
I think what you said, that it won't matter really who wins, and that the end game is the same. And I think a lot of our guests are feeling the same way. That it won't matter. But maybe some people have brought up the idea that a Biden win would accelerate the crash versus Trump maybe buying us a little more time. What do you think about that?
Well, on balance, the Democrats will spend more money than the Republicans. But, before the pandemic hit, we had a Republican government running trillion-dollar deficits. So it's not like the Republicans are still the party of small government. They're running trillion-dollar deficits just like the Democrats. So, there might be a slight difference in how much money is spent and how fast the currency is devalued, but not a big one. It's coming either way.
All right. Well, John Rubino of dollarcollapse.com. Be sure to sign up to his newsletter. It's excellent. And thanks for being with us.
Enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Okay, take care.